I love worshiping with you guys. So about 10 or 15 years ago, my husband and I were visiting my aunt and uncle in Austin. Now, my uncle is my mother's brother, and he was born 19 years after my mom. So he and I actually are closer in age and grew up more like siblings. Well, during a dinner conversation, he asked me if I had ever heard of 23andMe. I had not. And he explained that it's a genetic test which, and at that time, traced ancestry. It didn't have any of the health components to it that it does today, but it was an ancestry tracer. You see, his mother, my grandmother, was part Cherokee. And he was wondering if this test might tell us the exact percentage. So I agreed to do the test with him, and we would kind of compare results. Well, my husband and I came home, and time passed, and I'd actually forgotten about even sending in the swab. When one day, I got a concerning phone call from my uncle. Have you received your results from the genetic testing yet? I told him no, and I said, is there a problem? Well, let's just wait until your results get in, and we'll see. So a couple more days passed, and I was notified that my results were ready, so I was getting ready to open the results. But before I did that, I called my uncle to let him know that I was ready. Guess what? There isn't a trace of Cherokee in either of our DNA samples. How could that be? It was a family story. It had been handed down for at least 3 generations. I had even been in Long Grove. Remember when they had awesome shops there and there was a native store there? And I was in that store back in the 90s, and out of the blue, the shopkeeper looked at me and said, "Do you have Cherokee in your lineage?" And of course I said, "Yes." Well, my uncle was shaken a bit by this scientific revelation. The fact that his mother wasn't Cherokee begged a lot of questions. Why did she think she was? Why did she and we have physical traits that run a little bit parallel to Cherokee people? Did our ancestors not know who their parents were? Which opens up some questions that we weren't ready to dive into. This discovery was startling because we believed the family story that had been handed down. We embraced our Cherokee heritage. I wonder, though, if each of us believed we held DNA in common with all races and people, would we embrace each other a little bit more readily? Now, my guess is that some of you may have a similar story of being told something about your family or a family member and later found out that you had been misinformed. Stories are important. They bind us. They connect us to people and places. Stories anchor us to this world. Historically, as you all know, stories were handed down through oral tradition, and they were handed down by well-respected members of a family, tribe, clan, nation. Society's elders were the history keepers. Well, at this time in America, we have an epidemic of loneliness, and it affects our aged population the most. As we age, we lose connection. And this detachment is caused by many things: retirement, disagreements, physical distance, death, and a lack of being able to relate to one another due to the separation that is caused by years between. One of the things I appreciated about working in school was that it kept me young. Being around youth, we get exposed to their jargon, their music, their clothing styles, and all things that change with each generation. But not everyone is lucky enough to peer into the vitality of younger lives. You know this separation if you've ever made reference to a song, movie, TV show, novel, and had someone look at you with a totally blank, huh? If this has happened to you, you felt the disconnect of not having a shared history with someone. I was so grateful as my children were growing up that there were TV shows still on the network, right? They didn't have all the streaming services in those days. And we could watch shows. They understood Gilligan's Island. They didn't necessarily like it, but they at least, if I made a reference to, Gilligan or Green Acres or, something along that line, at least we had that shared, and the music, because the radio was still the primary source of gathering music. So my kids and I could talk about music. Forget it today. If this has happened to you, then you felt the disconnect of not having shared history with someone. Now, I am extremely blessed to have a friendship in my life that has been active for over 50 years. I am also lucky to have what I call less active friendships with people I've known since elementary school, right? And I trust you guys all have that as well. People who, although you don't talk very often, when you do come together, it's as comfortable now as it was back then. But my active friend, it's different. She has been a witness to my life for all of the stages, from high school to today. We have shared stories, and we don't have to explain stuff to each other. We communicate with the twitch of a facial muscle or an eye movement. And I really hope that you have someone like that in your life. When I was younger, I used to wonder why old people didn't seem to have as many friends as those of us in high school. I now understand that time is a commodity, and it gets devoted to other things as we age. Mortgages, car payments, food, insurance, all of those adulting things require money. And in order to get that money, we work 8 hours or more per day. The question asked by my younger self, why don't older people have as many friends as I do, got answered through time. Recently, though, something else occurred to me about why it gets more difficult to make friends as we age. It's the backstory. Our backstory, that regardless of our storytelling ability, loses something in the translation with people we barely know. Have you ever tried to recount a story that you thought was hilarious or emotionally moving, only to have it seemingly fall on deaf ears? Have you ever ended a story with these words? I guess you had to be there. It stands to reason that the elderly, who know the pain of losing the people who lived through their backstory, would suffer from loneliness. Building relationships takes time. And sometimes the backstory is never told. I lived with my grandparents for much of my childhood, and I was extremely close to my grandmother, the same Cherokee grandmother I mentioned earlier. She didn't talk much about her childhood, And she didn't share much wisdom she had gained over the years. But if I'm honest, when she tried, I'd roll my eyes. Oh boy, here we go, right? I regret thinking that I knew everything as a teenager. So for Christmas in 2022 and 2023, our daughter, Sarah, gave me a book like this as a gift. And this book is titled, "Tell Me Your Life Story, Grandma." Well, in 2022, I opened it up, right, and I found a bunch of prompts that sound like this. Did you feel connected to both of your parents growing up, or one more than the other? Why or why not? Describe the biggest influences in your life during your school years. In what ways did they influence you, good or bad? Have any events or happenings that you thought were major issues turned out to be a blessing in disguise? Well, then you look and see how much room they give you to answer those. Seriously? So, yeah, in 10 lines or less, describe the biggest influences in your life. So, I kind of disregarded her request for me to tell my life story, right? I just kind of put it away, and then she'll forget. The next year, I got almost an identical book from my daughter, right? So it suddenly occurred to me that my daughter wanted to know my life story. And she was beyond the age of rolling her eyes, although she did that a few times growing up. And she really cared about the experiences that have shaped me, my backstory. So in December of 2023, I began writing. This booklet is the result, and it was given to my kids this year for Christmas. Obviously, this memoir is told from my perspective, and sometimes the stories are filtered through the memory of a 4-year-old. But slant and all, it's 55 pages of the stories of my life. I am so grateful for Sarah's tenacity. Maybe, just maybe, one day my grandkids will wish that they had listened more to Gaga, and Sarah will say to them, "Hey, here, she wrote this." Yes, stories bind us, and they connect us through the generations. They bind us to our families, and they bind us collectively as a society and as a nation. Where were you when you heard about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, if you were old enough to know, to be here for that? And if that's beyond you, where were you when you heard about the assassination of John F. Kennedy? Or maybe the attack on the World Trade Center. When people who lived through those events get together, a story breaks out, right? Have you noticed? Have you noticed that when someone brings up the assassination of Kennedy, immediately someone goes to, I was in high school, I was in middle school, I heard it, the principal announced it over the PA, right? Have you ever noticed how stories break out when there's a collective memory? Stories that affect us collectively are extremely powerful, and they motivate us to a call to action. So is it any wonder that when we find out that the stories we have heard and believed are not true, we get angry? Our souls are stirred to fight injustice, to advocate for those whose voice isn't readily heard by those in power. You see, the shadow side of perpetuating stories is that stories can be used as a device to control Stories often contain misinformation, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes unknowingly. So an example of maybe an unknowingly misinforming someone might be, if you had lived during a certain era, you would have been told and you would have believed that the world was flat. Or you may have subjected yourself to a myriad of medical procedures that doctors genuinely believed were helpful. In these kinds of situations, the misguided story was told with sincerity, right? In an attempt to be a helper. Over the years, we've learned that many things we learned in our younger years have proven to be false. There's a 1995 publication written by James Lowen called Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's a work that analyzes the American history book and concludes that they are written from a Eurocentric and mythological viewpoint. And they are filled with false information. Now, that was a hard pill for me to swallow, because one of my responsibilities while I was working was curriculum and instruction and textbook choices. And so I had to believe it and had to look into it, and I had to say, yes, there are things that are in our textbooks, whether they're history textbooks, sociology textbooks, that are Eurocentric and mythological. History books are written, I hope they're not anymore. I've been retired long enough that I'm hoping there's been change, to perpetuate the story. The word history. Whose story are we telling? His, right? His story. We don't call it her story, right? But still, the most sinister use of the story are the examples of purposeful misinformation given in an attempt to control. Stories that my same grandmother used to euphemistically use the word instead of lies. We don't need to look much further than the stories of the settling of our nation. Stories told by Europeans to the indigenous people. Promises made and intentionally broken in an attempt to acquire land and power. Or the stories told through promises made to the freed slaves during Reconstruction. Promises of voting rights and land acquisition quickly turned to Jim Crow laws, murder, and the rise of the KKK. Lies that brave people like Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we celebrate tomorrow, fought hard to expose and correct. Intentional misinformation designed to control Black lives. It would be easier if we could totally believe or disregard the stories we've been told without needing to discern where the truth lies. Instead, stories create a tension in our lives because stories both ground us and disillusion us. So how do thoughtful, mature people tell their personal and cultural narrative while at the same time embracing revisions before sending it forward to future generations. How do we do that? By anchoring ourselves to something other than just the story. And accepting the words written 1,500 years ago by Greek philosopher Heraclitus. The only thing constant is change. So as you walk through your week, I invite you to choose one story you've been told that you believe, and I invite you to discern whether or not there might be some fact and fiction, and see if it might need a little bit of revision. It's okay to rewrite your story so that it more accurately reflects truth. And once you've done that, send it forward into history, herstory, theystory. Amen.